out what really is the basis of trusteeship. Something which people keep quoting Gandhi on, but I want to really get at what is the basic idea which would actually make us think of trusteeship as something which is a good thing to cotton on into and something we should actually therefore go and speak to the world about. Now the standard idea has already been put on the table, which is that typically you should consider the wealth in excess of that which is for your needs to be held in trust for society. And Gandhi really, if you read him, is talking of two reasons why you should do that. One is he believes that there is some role for egalitarianism in today's world. So there is an egalitarian argument to it. So there has to be at core some theory about justice and egalitarianism. But the second rider he brings in, if you read Gandhi carefully, is really about that this should be done voluntarily. And this is because of the belief that anything which is non-voluntary, and he basically even thinks that the state, unlike what economists think, that the state actually is a violent institution, that it basically infringes on people's rights. And therefore, a non-violent system of government being an impossibility, we should think of some way in which people voluntarily choose to do something like trusteeship. These two arguments that he's bringing into play, voluntarism and also egalitarianism, smack a little bit of the type of arguments that you see in political philosophy. I mean, if you think of the libertarian argument at one hand, it basically argues something as drastic as even taxation is theft by the state, which is not an argument Gandhi would actually go for, because unlike the libertarians, he's basically arguing that it's not about reciprocity as argued by the libertarians. It's not about reciprocity because you are self-interested. It's not about mutually beneficial cooperative schemes, which is what libertarians try to do in their minimalist state, but it's about something bigger. But before I get to that bigger thing, let me also at this stage mention this contrasting view that you see in political philosophy, which is basically that the domain of something like egalitarianism or justice is not because people participate in a mutually beneficial cooperative scheme, but because people happen to have capabilities and happen to have characteristics which are non-strategic. So in a tradition in philosophy, we talk about the fact that people are capable of rational action, or the fact that people actually have a capacity for happiness. In this way of looking at the world, the tradition is more subject-centered. But both these traditions have one underlying concept which goes right through them, and that is that people have a unity of self. And this is something I believe Gandhi is really arguing against, that people don't really have a unity of self, that we are actually multiple selves. And if we are multiple selves with multiple identities, then how is it, knowing that personality is plural, and that multiple modes of identity imply a sets of motivations, which then, each of which is then applicable in any particular domain, then how are we going to argue for various aspects of living and how people should act in this world? We all know that this is true, that people actually have multiple selves. That, for example, I could be a very selfish CEO at work, but I could be very generous in my home. Or I could be very generous to my local community. That means that there is no unity of personality. And I think it's this idea really that Gandhi is pushing. And the way in which he pushes it is to basically argue that there is a vital and enduring part of our being, what he calls the spiritual self, which involves, in a sense, the deepest layers of our being. He calls it the spirit or the truth, and he actually equates that with God. And I quote, he says, "I have known God as truth." When I read him, he says that very clearly. And he really argues that the attempt of his life is to align the spiritual self with his actual living in the world, his political self. And that he actually faced many roadblocks in trying to do that, which is actually all there in his autobiography. The problem of how do I align my spiritual self with my material self, so to speak. And in doing that, his style was not Indian, because the Indians idea of the self is really an idea about how do I withdraw from the world. Okay? It's really an idea about how do I renounce the world. I mean, the classic sage is one who renounces the world, but Gandhi's idea is no, we must actually change it. I must actually participate in the world and change it. Okay? And so I quote from him, he says, "My spiritual seeking, whether original or not, has always been in the form of social service. I have not yet understood that there is anything like spiritual or moral value apart from work and action." So Gandhi's vision of a spiritual self is of a person who must act in a world which is rife with inequality, strife, and violence. Okay? And that is the core of his spirituality. And at that point, he talks about what it is that individuals are capable of. And he talks of a type of sympathy that individuals are capable of, fellow feeling. Okay? And to my mind, this is not very different from a strand of economics, okay, which actually talks about the capacity for empathy. Okay? People who read a little more into economics than the standard textbook economics know very well that Adam Smith was the person who actually talked about the capacity for sympathy in his theory of moral sentiments. And he talks about it there as a different capacity that individuals have than the capacity to truck, barter, and exchange, which is what he talks about in The Wealth of Nations. And the reason there is that he's really talking about this as motivating a type of exchange which is different from the market exchange. And that exchange is the exchange of gifts which are possible if we have this capacity for sympathy. So I believe that Gandhi is really talking about that, that when behavior stems from sympathy, one does good to others. And in the process of doing good to others, you also end up doing good to yourself. So the political life of Gandhi is not about duplicity, and it's not about the standard idea that we have of politics, of scheming, etc. But it's driven by a politics of conscience, because there is a seeking for truth and fellow feeling. Okay? The truly spiritual act is then performed by someone who is personally involved and gives the gifts of his person as well as along with whatever else he might give. So the important corollary that I see in Gandhi is that if action is inevitable in life, okay, spirituality cannot be dissociated from material life and worldly pursuits. And so you have to ask yourself the question that if action is inevitable, how do we spiritualize life? Okay? And Gandhi then suggests that the only way to do that is to become detached from the results of our actions. Okay? And that we must not renounce action, but we must renounce the fruits of the action. And so I quote from him, and he says, "When there is no desire for fruit, there is no temptation for untruth or himsa." And he also disagrees, therefore, with forced dispossession. And I again quote, "Should the wealthy be dispossessed of their possessions? No. For then society will be the poorer for it, will lose the gifts of a man who knows how to accumulate wealth. The rich man will be left in possession of his wealth," as many speakers earlier said, "of which he will use that which he reasonably needs and act as a trustee of the remainder to be used for society." And in another place, he actually talks of depriving ownership to being akin to killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. Okay. So this implies three tenets to me of the Gandhian way of looking at the world. The first is that you must act in the material world and accumulate wealth. You have no option then to do that. The fruits of such action, the second tenet, okay, however, should be foregone. Okay. And the third is that this should be done voluntarily. Okay. Now, why voluntarily? Again, to quote him, because a violent and bloody revolution is a certainty one day, okay, unless there is a voluntary abdication of riches and the power that riches give and sharing them for the common good. So now, if you think about this, it's a little curious sort of an argument. Okay? How is it possible to pursue a goal, okay, which is the accumulation of wealth, and yet not desire the fruits of that goal, which is the profits that would come from the accumulation of the wealth? Okay? And when Mr. Gopal Krishnan was speaking, he used the example of a mountaineer. Okay? And I think, though he pushed it to the idea of looking at ethics, okay, my own experience in mountaineering, which was something I used to do a lot of earlier, okay, tells me that there is something there about this idea of pursuing a goal and not desiring the fruit. Most people, I think, unfortunately, think of mountaineers as people who want to basically climb mountains in order to climb and being on a summit. Okay? But as a mountaineer, in fact, that was the most depressing thing, that you actually reached the summit. Okay? The importance of mountaineering was the type of interaction that you had within yourself and with your colleagues, okay, by the conditions that a mountain imposed on you. Okay? It actually made you think about the types of reserves of capacities that you had, the feelings that you actually generated to your colleagues in situations of danger, and it actually made you know about enriching experiences within yourself which vanished the moment you reached the summit. And if you actually craved those enriching experiences, which we did as mountaineers, then you actually had to go back to the mountain. You had to keep, in a sense, interacting with the substance of the mountain in order that those enriching experiences became possible. Okay? The summit, if there was no summit, okay, the summit is a goal we set up, just like the goal of accumulating wealth. Okay? But the enjoyment is in the process of the pursuit. The moment you reach the summit, the enjoyment went. Okay? So what I'm basically trying to say is that, there are some mental states which can only be achieved as byproducts. And I think that's, in a sense, what Gandhi is sort of alluding to. The classic mental state which can be achieved as a byproduct, we all know, is the state of sleep. Okay? If you try to actually, think about, it's somewhat contradictory to sort of say that I will concentrate now about going to sleep, because sleep involves basically the absence of concentration. Okay? It's contradictory. And those of you who know that, when you've actually tried to lull yourself to sleep and found it impossible to do so, and what you've done is, in a sense, distracted yourself by pretending that you're not bothered about sleep, by taking up a book or by watching a film. And in the process of doing that, you got sleep as a byproduct. Okay? So certain states, certain mental states, okay, are really questions of byproducts of other actions. You can't will them directly. Okay? And I think that the benefits of giving up the fruit, okay, is that when you transfer this fruit to others in lieu of self-possession, it results in doing good to others. And in the process of doing good to others, as Gandhi then argues, the byproduct happens that you do good to yourself. Okay? So in the process, you realize that satisfaction that can emanate from actions which are not self-centered, but also from the pursuit of sympathy. Okay? And this, I believe, is really the basis of Gandhi's pursuit of spiritual progress. Okay? But then he makes a lot of mistaken arguments, which actually, in a sense, distract from what he's actually pursuing. He argues, he gives all sorts of statements which I think are. Oops. Okay. He's almost sort of prodding people to give up their riches. Okay, despite this huge spiritual argument that we have just been making. Okay, because he says a violent and bloody revolution is a certainty one day, unless there is a voluntary abdication of riches, okay, and the power that riches give and the sharing of them for the common good. If only the capitalist would read the signs of the time. There is no other choice between voluntary surrender and, on the other, the impending chaos by the awakened but ignorant famishing millions. Okay? So in a sense, this makes the motivation for trusteeship somewhat like a bribe. Okay? It's basically saying that I should give up my riches because it allows me to broker peace with the impoverished in society. Okay? And I think this is uncalled for after the types of arguments that we could make for trusteeship. Because as we all know, that if you make a gift and the gift is not out of regard, okay, which is really what Gandhi is talking about in his more philosophical stance, then a gift is misconstrued. It's almost like the regard which is false by a trader who's basically trying to show regard for you because that is a way of facilitating economic transaction. Okay? And it is not, which is motivated by self-interest. And so you recognize that more as a bribe than as a gift. Okay? And so I think that a gift that is misconstrued will also be rejected. And this is part of the reason why maybe large numbers of people didn't really take on to the Gandhian argument of trusteeship. I mean, he went down that path, I think, by trying to actually prod people to take it on, when it's really antithetical to the main argument that he was really looking for. Okay, I think Gandhi would have been better off, okay, and I'll quickly try and end with this, if he had directly asked the question, okay, does anyone have the rights to the full market value of whatever he happens to own, of an asset that he happens to own? Okay? And I think he would have come to the conclusion that he doesn't. Okay? And I think there's a lot of political philosophy which actually would support an argument like this. Okay? Take a very simple example. Okay? Supposing my father happened to purchase a small piece of land in a suburb of Bombay, which is today called the Bandra Kurla complex, okay, in 1950. Okay? And in 1950, he purchased this for 5,000 rupees, which was the price in those days. Okay? Now, since then, till today, there's been huge economic change, demographic change, a lot of migration, etc., and there's been a lot of pressure on that land. Today, that same piece of land is worth about 50 lakhs. Okay? 1,000 times the value of the land has gone up. What are the rights to the market value of that land? Okay? Under a legal system, 50 lakhs is what he should get. But if you think about it a little carefully, what should be rewards? Rewards should be proportional to contribution. Okay? And let's say my father bought that land out of hard labor that he did, and he put down the 5,000 rupees then. Okay? So what he's entitled to today, if rewards are proportional to contribution, is really that 5,000 rupees plus some fair rate of return. Okay? However we arrive at that fair rate of return. That fair rate of return is not going to be the value of 50 lakhs today. Okay? So in a sense, there are many such instances that we can think of where, because of, say, scarcities of goods, positive transactions costs, or barriers to trade, it may be possible that the price of an item, okay, is more than what it costs an agent to bring it to the market. Okay? In that case, we can make a claim that there are two types of rights which go with ownership. Okay? There is the right to control an asset, and there is the right to income from an asset. I think Gandhi's main claim is that you have a right to control the asset, okay? But you don't have a right to the income from the asset. And therefore, in a sense, control rights are more strategic and more primary than income rights. And you can again think of this as being very logical from the point of view of an example. Supposing on the island which Shubhashish's marketers went to, there were only two people. Okay, say there was one guy called Arjun and there was someone called Lakshmi. Okay, and Arjun happened to have a book, and Lakshmi had some fruit, let's say 5 apples. Okay, and Arjun basically wants the apples because he prefers that, and Lakshmi wants the book. If trade was possible, they would actually trade that, right, and get that going. But on that island, okay, they could also think strategically. They could say, I would like both. I would like the book and the apples, okay, and I would not like to lose either. Okay, now this is a classic prisoner's dilemma. Okay, I mean, this is a situation in which you can't get trade going because I don't have control rights. Okay, and I don't have control rights, then I cannot create the surplus which is possible from that trade. If I cannot create the surplus which is possible from the trade, then I have nothing really left to distribute. Okay? So therefore, there is a distinction between the control rights over an asset and the income rights that would come from the surplus that would be created because the control rights were there in the first place. I think Gandhi's notion of trusteeship, to my mind, if you think about it logically, I don't have the time to go through the argument in more detail than this, but I think logically it is this. It is that people should have control rights over assets. Okay? And just like Shubhashish was saying, I mean, we are really therefore going to debate about, okay, those are individual rights that people would have. Then the debate is, what are the income rights that you have from the control of the asset? And that depends on what sort of system you put in place, which gives the inducements, okay, which actually would distribute out the surplus that would take place as a result of the ownership of the assets. Okay? So I think Gandhi, the reason Gandhi got derailed was because, despite making a good claim on the basis of voluntarism and basically making claims about what it is that individuals in society should do with the wealth that they create, okay, and the problem of actually separating out the fruit from the ownership, okay, he got derailed by actually then trying to sort of, become more of a pamphleteer than actually talking about the basis of that argument. Okay, so by actually pushing people to say that, if you don't do it, then someone else will basically get affected, and therefore, as a result, you are actually being prodded to do something non-voluntarily, whereas at heart he's actually a thinker of voluntarism. I think derailed the Gandhian experiment. Okay, and it's time, I think, now to start rethinking the analytical foundations of this and giving it a little more flesh. Thank you.